working people. We were the first college to admit women to come to study, although I should say, risk of damaging our reputation, that there was a debate in the governing body in the 1840s or 30s when this happened about whether women should be allowed through the front door or not. The result is not recorded. That's for
But nowadays?
And nowadays, in fact, a higher percentage of women than men, very high percentage of BAME students, reflecting that in London, and extraordinarily diverse. Everything from 18-year-old school leavers who want to get on and work and study at the same time. They do exist. Those who have 18-year-old children may not believe that they exist, but that sort of person does actually exist, quite rare, right up to the person who, when she registered for the fourth year of her geography degree, couldn't quite register on the computer because the computer couldn't credit the fact that she was over 100 years old. To accept her date of birth as being over 100 years old. So we have everything from 18 to 100. And she actually, this lady, successfully graduated at 101.
Whoa!
So it's never too late, David.
I hope that wasn't aimed at me. And just so I know, do you have any distinguished academic colleagues there that I might know?
We have a number of sort of Orlando Figes is one that you might have heard of, who's the historian who's written extensively on the Russian Revolution. There are a number of leading people who work on early onset autism. They've identified signs of autism in terms of brain activity in babies as young as 6 months old that seem to be predictive of autism. So a whole range of different things. We have law department, management department, so right across all subjects really, except for medicine and engineering, which are quite different.
Any distinguished psychologists?
Yes, certainly. Well, I'm not sure there certainly are brain imaging type people in that area.
David, I'm going to carry on until you mention my brother-in-law's name.
Ah, of course. I'm so sorry. Yes, of course. And of course, Professor Stephen Frosch, my dear friend, David's brother-in-law, and a man who, unlike most academics, has a huge amount of common sense. And you can pass that back to him.
I will indeed. So tell me, how did you become a collector and why Judaica?
Okay, so I think the first thing is I don't believe that you do become a collector. I believe that collecting is ingrained, perhaps in your genes, but that they say collectors are born, not made. So I think I was always collecting. When I was a young boy, my mother says, I used to say just one more book and just one more book. And I tried at one point I was going down different branches of W.H. Smith, collecting all the paperback James Bond novels. And I think then at some point I had an epiphany and I realized even in those days, new books could just be ordered. And there was no point in searching W.H. Smiths for new books because you could order them. So I started collecting secondhand books. And I found I was collecting a sort of random collection of things, Lloyd George's war memoirs is one that comes to mind, various other things. And I thought, I've got to specialize. What can I specialize in? Well, science I could specialize in. Problem is, if you're a scientist and you buy old science books, you're likely to get very confused about what's still correct and what's not in a 19th century science book. So I gave that up. And so I thought Judaica. So I started Judaica. That was too big a field. And so then I came on to Anglo Judaica. And so now really I connect everything that is to do with the Jews in the United Kingdom. So England, Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland.
Okay, so I know you've got loads of things to show us. What's the oldest thing that you have?
Okay, well, David, people always ask that. I'm going to begin actually with the second oldest. So
okay.
I have got a deed from the medieval times of Anglo Jewry from before 1290. But I was going to start by showing, and I do apologize to you all if you can't see these things very well. I want to show the actual objects. And I do say that if you find it difficult and whatever, I'm happy to come when circumstances allow to Belmont to actually show you.
Excellent.
This is probably the second oldest thing. This is a deed, and it's a deed, so it follows on from a deed which is in the Jewish Museum, where Benjamin Levy, in 1696, he gets a piece of land from a non-Jew, which is now Alderney Road Cemetery. And in this deed, which is much more significant, dated the following day, he gives it to the members of the synagogue in Shoemaker's Lane, Duke's Place. So this, in 1696, is the first mention of the first Ashkenazi synagogue which later became known as the Great Synagogue. So that's probably, if you'd asked me what was my most significant item, David, I would also show this. So that's one of the oldest and probably the most significant, and it sort of starts the story that I'm going to try and tell you in the next half an hour, 50 minutes.
So that was, 30 odd years after we were permitted to return.
Yes, 34 years after.
Although technically speaking, we were never permitted to return. We were permitted, I think, to build a cemetery or something or another. It was some weird thing that we were allowed to do.
It was actually to do with a ship was seized as being an enemy alien ship. And then the person who owned it, who was Jewish, said, I'm not an enemy alien. I am a refugee, a Jewish refugee from Spain. And they said, oh, all right, then carry on. So they carried on. And it was actually very important, David, because had there been a formal readmission with a law, this was, of course, under Cromwell, it's very likely that Charles II would have repealed it, because he repealed all the laws that were passed under the Protectorate. So because there was no formal readmission, they were able to just carry on as they were after the restoration of the monarchy.
Yeah, I think a lawyer once pointed out to me that we were never actually excluded per se from the England. We were expelled, but that didn't mean that we were guaranteed that we couldn't actually live there. It was an expulsion of a population at a particular time.
The lawyer Cromwell managed to get, because Cromwell was very pro the readmission against a lot of opposition, Cromwell managed to get the lawyers to say that the expulsion order actually only applied to the people who were sent out in 1290, all of whom, of course, were long since dead 360 years later. So therefore, it wasn't an expulsion of every Jew, it was an expulsion of the Jews who happened to be there at the time.
So you've got a very early land deed, and although the earliest returnees were Sephardi, it was very quickly that there were Ashkenazim coming in from where?
Mainly, well, from almost everywhere, actually. I mean, they came from all around. But in fact, interestingly, the one who signed this deed, Benjamin Levy, who I think came from Holland, he actually didn't need the cemetery because he was sufficiently sort of prosperous that the Sephardim were willing to bury him in their cemetery, which was what he had. So he did it really very altruistically for the much poorer Ashkenazim who were coming in, attracted by obviously the sort of commercial opportunities that there would be in Britain.
So the land deed that you just showed us, that was like a private transaction between somebody else and him, yes?
So he acquired the land the day before this lease, this deed, from a non-Jewish farmer, because it was farmland in those days. And then he gives it by this deed to the members of the synagogue in Shoemaker's Lane, Duke's Place. And there was a long argument between Cecil Roth in the 30s and various others as to whether the Great Synagogue had stood on its original site longer than Bevis Marks, which was started in 1701. There was a Sephardic school before, but it was started in 1701. And so this argument went back and forth in the Jewish Chronicle. In fact, this deed does prove that the Great Synagogue stood on its site before Bevis Marks stood on its site.
Ah, who knew?
But as we shall see later, the Great Synagogue came to an unfortunate end. So
indeed,
Marks, of course, is still there.
Does Shoemaker's Lane still exist?
I think it doesn't. I think it sort of was an alley off Duke's Place, which does still exist, which is still
yes,
there.
Of course, yeah. Okay, so what have you got for us next, David?
Okay, so I was going to start with that thing about the Great Synagogue. So say that this Ashkenazi synagogue became the sort of main shul or main Ashkenazi shul, the first one founded. But as always amongst Jews, disputations broke out. And so in around 1706, the then rabbi of the Great Synagogue, who we regard as the first chief rabbi, who was called Aaron Hart, he did a divorce for somebody. This person was leaving Britain to try their luck in the West Indies and to get away from their gambling debts. And so he wanted to divorce his wife before he left, and just in case she was left as an aguna or whatever. And he didn't want anybody to know, because if they would know, his debtors would realize that he was running away. And so the divorce was done very quietly by Aaron Hart. And another member of the community, Mordecai Hamburger, he questioned this and said that you can't do a divorce silently, quietly, you've got to have it checked properly, and probably she wasn't properly divorced. And so Aaron Hart responded by putting him into Chayrim, excommunicating him, and he published this book, which I have here, which is called Urim V'Tumim, what was on the high priest's breastplate, And I don't know how well you can see that, but that is the title page of it. And you can probably see at the bottom in big letters, Aleph Nun Aleph. And that is where he writes, under the wonderful reign of our beneficent Queen Anna, Queen Anne. So, and that is the first, probably the first book that a Jew published in Hebrew in England. So if you think of all the scholarly works that have come since, we didn't start in Anglo Jewry with the scholarly work, we started with a disputation. And so the Hambra Synagogue, as it was called after Mordechai Hamburger, came into existence. And a little bit later, the new synagogue came into existence on the basis of another dispute. So now there were three synagogues very close together to one another, all in the city. If you visualize where the Gherkin is now, they were all just around that area there, and they were all quite magnificent. I just want to show you one picture. I hope you're going to be able to see it, but this is the Great Synagogue, taken in around 1808 from Ackerman's Microcosm of London. So it was considered sufficiently important to be included in the sort of magnificent buildings of London. And perhaps slightly more quirkily, there are lots of pictures of the new synagogue, but here is a biscuit tin, relatively modern, which decided to use 4 pictures of limited edition collector's series, wrapped vanilla flavored dark caramel with almonds. Somebody had eaten them when I acquired this, but you can see one of the shuls that they chose to illustrate was the new synagogue. So there's a picture of the new synagogue.
Whoa.
On a biscuit tin.
So I'm confused about something, David. I thought the new synagogue was in Egerton Road.
No, so I should have said that at the beginning of the 20th century, following an enormous fight, the new synagogue was moved from the city, which is what you just saw, to Stamford Hill. And there was an enormous fight about that. And eventually it was reconstituted in Stamford Hill, where it lasted almost up to the present day. I'm not sure whether there's still a very small minion of new synagogue members who daven in a hall, in a small room. But now it's a Hasidic shtibel. So, well, not shtibel, it's a large shul, which is used by a Hasidic sect.
Is it Belts? I've forgotten.
Bells, that's right, Bells.
Yeah.
So now we've got 3 synagogues, all very close to one another, and they're all competing with one another, and so on. So it all got a bit sort of difficult, and they all sort of eventually they tried to cooperate together, even though they'd arisen from a disputation. So this is a little pamphlet which I'm going to read to you. It's called Articles of a New Treaty between the Great Hambra and New Synagogues, 1835. And you can see why this treaty has been whatever. So rule number 9, that the burial of orchim or strangers shall be apportioned amongst the 3 synagogues in the following manner. The Great Synagogue shall bury 1/2, presumably 1/2 of the people, not 1/2 of individual people. The Hambra Synagogue 1/4, and the New Synagogue 1/4. So they had to sort of try and cooperate together. And that process came sort of to a head when eventually they elected the first elected chief rabbi in 1840s. So up till then, mostly the Great Synagogue's rabbi had been seen as the chief rabbi. Sometimes the other shuls had appointed rabbis and they'd sort of fought amongst themselves, but generally he was seen as chief rabbi. And then they elected Nathan Marcus Adler. Now I've got a sort of big thing here, which I don't know how well you're going to be able to see, but what I hope you can see is at the top is a picture of Nathan Marcus Adler as a young man. Underneath, we've got the scene of his election. So you can see the magnificent new synagogue. And then these other 2 documents, which are the documents that he gave as his sort of credentials. And interestingly, they are in German, and he actually preached his inaugural sermon in the Great Synagogue in German. I don't think today they would accept a chief rabbi who couldn't preach in English. He did eventually learn English. And very quickly, he moved to impose his authority. So he issued this pamphlet, Laws and Regulations for all the synagogues of the British Empire, 1847. And so only a couple of years and after he was elected. And let's just read the first paragraph, because I think it tells you exactly how, whatever. The duty of superintending the synagogue devolves on the chief rabbi when present, in his absence on the dayan, in the absence of the dayan on the minister, in the absence of the minister on the reader, provided these latter officers be authorized for that purpose by the chief rabbi. He is imposing his authority here onto this disparate group of synagogues, not only in London, where you had the Great, the Hambra, and the New, but also on the spread out congregations across the provinces, and also actually even across the empire, because later, of course, Australia, Canada, and so on all accepted his authority. And that's where the United Synagogue came from. As you know, David, I've recently published a book
Yeah.
about the 150th anniversary of the United Synagogue, and so a lot of these objects are to do with that. And in 1870,
David, can I just? I want to pick up three separate things. Number one, he preached in German, not in Yiddish.
Yes, in German, certainly not in Yiddish.
Number two, you referred to him as the others as appointing rabbis. Was there still a tradition that everybody except the chief rabbi was a minister?
Oh, we're coming to that. We'll come to that in a moment, David.
Okay.
We'll come to that when we get on a bit further. Those ones in the other synagogues would have been rabbis because they actually didn't accept the chief rabbi's authority. That was why they got appointed. But the period we're coming to now, then I'll mention what's going on in terms of who's a rabbi and who's not a rabbi.
Okay, and then thirdly, he's become chief rabbi of the empire.
Yes.
That's an extraordinary thing to have sort of be able to do. You're talking about Canada and Australia.
Yes, and in the 1850s, he actually sent a Diane Aaron Levy, to carry out a divorce for somebody, so where the woman was in London and the man had been sent to Australia, possibly as a convict, and he sent him to Australia to carry out the divorce there. So it was entirely under his authority. And as an interesting, amusing sideline, when this Aaron Levy set off on the long journey back to England to bring back the divorce bill from the husband to the wife in London, the Melbourne community, which was a small nascent community, presented him with a cow. And the cow was brought on ship, and he was able to have milk from the cow to ensure that he was satisfied with the kashrus of the milk throughout the 3-month voyage back to Australia. But if you think about it, he didn't just put him on a flight to go there. He sent him there. It took a 6-month round trip to show that this was their authority, and he sent the Diane to Australia. So
that's extraordinary. Okay, so you've got us to the 1860s.
So we're now up to 1870, in fact, where we have here the United Synagogue Act. So it took an act of parliament to produce the United Synagogue. And this act is just one page. So what you see on the screen, there's about a 30-page commentary, but the act is one page, an act for confirming a scheme of the charity commissioners for the Jewish United Synagogues. And whereas it is expedient that the said scheme should be confirmed, be it enacted by the Queen's most excellent majesty in this present parliament and by the authority of the same as follows. Number one, the said scheme shall be confirmed and take effect. So that's all it says. And that set up the United Synagogue. Now, very interestingly, by this stage, there were, of course, also the Bayswater Shul and the Central Shul, 5 founding shuls. And if any member of any of these shuls objected to the formation of the United Synagogue, the charity commissioners would not recommend it to Parliament. So if you think about now, you had to get 5 shuls to merge together, and nobody could be, not one single person could be opposed, not in a 2/3 majority or a 50-50 majority. And there was opposition from the Hamborough Shul. And the Hamborough Shul, which was already a bit on its last legs, members tried to stop the merger and said the United Synagogue will close us down as soon as we get to the merger. So what happened was that the United Synagogue, the nascent United Synagogue, bought them off in a very clever way. It said the Hamborough will never be closed. As long as the United Synagogue exists, the Hamborough will never be closed. Now, I'm afraid for those of you who want to go next Shabbos to Dublin in the Hamborough Shul, you won't be able to find it, but it was never closed. In 1935, it was merged with the Great Synagogue to form the Great and Hamborough Synagogue. So they avoided the closure by merging it with the Great Synagogue. We'll come to the end of the story of the Great Synagogue in a moment.
Where was the Hamborough, David?
Sorry?
Where was the Hamborough?
It was right next to the Great Synagogue, but then later it was moved to Fenchurch Street in the 1890s, and then it remained there until it closed in the 1930s. But it was always the sort of sick man of the United Synagogue. It never quite had its own standing, and never certainly was comparable to the Great Synagogue. So now, David, we get to the bit that you mentioned about who was a rabbi. So Nathan Adler was a rabbi, and he sent his son, Herman Adler, to Prague to get smicha. And these actually here are the original smichas that Herman Adler got in Prague. And just for those of you who are interested in collecting, you might be wondering, how do I have these smichas of Hermann Adler? How do I have the letters that Nathan Adler used for his candidature? All because many years ago, a very well-known collector from Golders Green went into the law offices of a firm called Adler and Perot, which had been founded by Elkan Adler, the son of the chief rabbi, and he was no longer alive. But the people there said to him, Mr. So-and-so said to this collector, you might be interested to know that they're clearing out the Adler family residence. Why don't you go and see if there's anything there for you? So he ran off there at top speed, as collectors do when they found out that there's something exciting going on. And he found the builders throwing huge amounts of rubbish onto a skip. Now, this was 50, 60 years ago, but he gave the builders £1 a sack and ran off with all the sacks of rubbish. And in there were a number of documents that you will see tonight, including those smichas, and including also this notebook, which contains Hermann Adler's Bar Mitzvah drosha in Hebrew and in English. And I'm just going to read you, before we come back to Who's a Rabbi, I can't resist reading you from the last little part of it, where he says, let the ship of my existence toss vehemently, and the hands grow faint. The Lord who delivered the pious favorite from the stormy sea, I think that must be Jonah he's referring to him I entrust my future, my life, my salvation, here and in eternity. Now, of course, you ask the question, David, I'm sure in your mind, if nobody else could be a rabbi, why did Hermann Adler get sent to Prague to become a rabbi, when every other minister was not allowed to be rabbi, where one minister who did get smicha on the continent was not allowed to be called up as Morenu Harav in his own synagogue, and had to go to Leeds whenever he wanted to be called up as Morenu Harav, because of course he was training him for the chief rabbinate. So he had seen Hermann Adler as his successor, so he didn't mind him having smicha, and indeed Hermann Adler succeeded him as chief rabbi and became the second of the dynasty.
Sorry, David, so there's two questions there. One is,
here, while you're talking, David, here's Hermann Adler as caricatured in Vanity Fair, which was an English magazine.
one is when did Jews College start? Can you remind us?
1855.
But it was producing ministers, not rabbis.
Yes.
And would it have been unusual to have gone to Prague? It wasn't, in my thinking, not one of the great yeshivas of Europe.
No, it's an interesting question. I mean, he got smicha from 3 rabbonim in Prague. I know people have written about his period in Prague, but you're right, David, nobody addresses why did he go to Prague. Interestingly, I have to say that in around 1900, Jews College did start giving smichas. It gave smicha to a couple of people, both of whom became dayanim on the Beis Din. And it's very interesting that the chief rabbi, Rabbi Mervis, asked me a few years ago, why in England are dayanim called Dayan Ehrentreu, Dayan Abramsky, Dayan Berger, whatever, whereas everywhere else they're called Rabbi so-and-so, Dayan of Yerushalayim, Dayan of Monzi, or whatever it may be. And I think the answer is because they could not use, even though they had smicha, they didn't want them to use the title rabbi. So if they were called reverend, they appeared just like an ordinary cheder teacher who could call himself reverend. So you had to call yourself Dayan in order to distinguish you from the sort of the reverend, who could be anybody who was practicing as a teacher or whatever it may be. So there were a lot of consequences of this. In the end, of course, they started giving smichas and they allowed people to be called rabbi, but it took a long time before that happened.
Sorry, I interrupted your flow. You showed us this picture of...
So I was just showing you the picture of, and now I was going to
Hermann Adler in Vanity Fair.
I was going to go on and show you this, and I don't know again how well you're going to see it, but I just want to show you this is the start of the career of the man who became the next chief rabbi, Joseph Hermann Hertz. You only need to see the top half. So here he is as a very young man, that's him there, with his community in Witwatersrand in Johannesburg. And on the right hand, on the other side, as you can see it, is the order of service for when he was inducted in 1898, printed on silk. Now, if you think about it, Johannesburg, a gold rush frontier town, and yet in 1898, they actually printed this on silk as a order of service. Now, Hertz had a problem because Hertz was an Orthodox Jew who went to the Jewish Theological Seminary, which is now conservative, but in those days was Orthodox. And he was effectively too frum for most American synagogues. So he went to a shul when he graduated in Syracuse, New York, left there because they voted for mixed seating of men and women. And yet he couldn't go to the frum immigrants shuls because he wasn't a Yiddish speaker. They wanted a Yiddish speaking Rov. So he went off to South Africa, where he was there for a number of years, perhaps because there was nowhere else to go. And yet it actually became the making of him. Why? Because there he became a prominent supporter of the British against the Boers in the Boer War. And he came to the attention of Lord Milner, the colonial secretary, who recommended him to Lord Rothschild and said, "This is your chief rabbi." So a rather odd way to choose a chief rabbi. And there was a huge fight between him, Hertz, and Diane Hyamson, who was one who had a Jews College smicha and was the right-hand man of Chief Rabbi Adler. But in the end, Lord Rothschild won, as the Rothschilds generally do. And at the end of a day's speaking and voting, all of which was published verbatim in the Jewish Chronicle, including the slanders of each candidate by the other candidate's supporters. And at the end of all this, the Lord Rothschild is said to have remarked, "I hope there is never another election of a chief rabbi in my lifetime." And there wasn't, so he was all right there. And so Hertz came along, and Hertz was, as many of you will know, a very dominant figure. He's supposed to have said, of him it was said, he never ceased to look for a peaceful solution when all other possibilities had failed. And of course, immediately after he took office, the First World War came along. And he really rose to the occasion. He published this little siddur. So this is a small siddur, which was sent to the men at the front. There it is. And the first edition of the Book of Jewish Thoughts. I don't know if people still give the Book of Jewish Thoughts as a bar mitzvah present, but it was a sort of standard one many years ago. But this is actually the very first one sent to the fighting men, which I bought for £1. Jews, of course, fought in the First World War, won every decoration. And I just want to show you, these are the medals in my collection of a Lieutenant Wilfred Rosen. And for those of you who know militaria, the one that I'm pointing to is the Military Cross, which he won in the campaign in Palestine, where the British forces moved through Palestine against the Turks and took Jerusalem. And here's his citation: "For conspicuous gallantry and devotion to duty during an attack on a village. Under heavy machine gun fire, he pulled the line together, charged forward, and captured 18 prisoners." So
Whoa!
Who fought in the First World War.
Was he, David? Was he a member? Was he part of the Jewish Legion? He was under Allenby, or what?
Interesting. I thought somebody was going to ask me that, but as you know, probably, David, the Jewish Legion were involved in the campaign, but there were lots of other British units, and some of them had Jews. So I have got medals from those who were in the Jewish Legion. But generally, the main fighting, because the Jewish Legion did a few battles, but they were generally not put in the front line for a lot of these things due to probably anti-Semitism. Allenby, who we celebrate, was actually probably a bit of an anti-Semite, and this Wilfred Rosen was in the sort of another part of the British Army. And I want to mention one other thing about Hertz and in the sort of interwar years, actually maybe a couple of things. One is this letter, which is signed by Hertz, and he's writing to Diane Lazarus about Hertz Chumash. I'm sure all of you, or many of you, have been using the Hertz Chumash. But I want to read you this. So he's inviting him to come. He says, "I'm therefore inviting a number of men who agree as to the vital necessity of this undertaking, the Hertz Chumash, to meet at my house, 48 Hamilton Terrace, on Thursday, October the 7th, the day prior to my departure for the Dominions, when the plan will be fully mapped out and the work allocated." In other words, I'm going away for 6 months to South Africa, Canada, and America. And by the time I come back, you will have translated the Chumash. And indeed, when the Chumash came out, or when it was in proof, and it said the Chumash of Chief Rabbi Hertz, various ministers, remember they served under Hertz, but they took the bold step of writing to him and saying, "Look, we translated all this stuff. Why are we not on it? Why are we not listed on the title page?" And he wrote back, "I am the chief rabbi, and this is my Chumash, and you are acknowledged in the acknowledgements. That is more than enough." And so they were never acknowledged. The other thing I want to show from the interwar days is about the Cunard ships. Now, the Cunard ships, shipping was much more important in those days, very few airplanes and so on. And so lots of Jews went on the ships. lots of competitions for those Jews. And so on Cunard and on some of the others, they had kosher china. So here is a kosher cup and saucer from the Cunard liner. And you can probably see it says kosher milk. And then actually underneath in Hebrew, it says what passes for milchik. They kept sort of reprinting this. And of course, the people doing it onto the cups had no idea what they were doing. So every minute it all changed the Hebrew got a bit corrupted. But these are actually now very sought after by Cunard collectors because they're the same as the ordinary Cunard ones, but because they had much less wear rather, they are more sought after because they're generally in better condition. And all this was under Hertz's supervision. So here's a menu from a Cunard liner, Friday, June the 23rd, 1939, from the Queen Mary, kashrus under the direct supervision of the Chief Rabbi and Beth Din and the Kashrus Commission of England. Strictly kosher menu, luncheon. Now, I can't read all this because we'll be here till tomorrow, but you can have fruit juice, smoked salmon, cucumbers, herrings, vegetable soup, braised rolled shoulder of veal, boiled fresh ox tongue, fried borscht sausage and egg, which you have to wait 10 minutes for, jacket and boiled new potatoes, cold chicken, cold veal, cold roast beef, borscht, lettuce salad, French and Russian dressing, compote of fruit, fruit and plain cake, lemon tea, matzahs and black coffee.
Sorry, David, did you say that was Friday lunch?
That was Friday lunch, yes. But if you
I presume by
that,
Friday supper you had indigestion.
This is just 3 months before the war. But for those who remember the Bournemouth hotels, I think it was probably rather like the Bournemouth hotels. Everything you could eat, except, of course, if you fell overboard, you would probably sink like a stone. But anyway, but I just want to tell you that because after the war, it ceased to be under Hertz's supervision, but they continued to produce, as they put new china, they put kosher versions, and they claimed to serve kosher food. And there's a famous story of a rabbi, very frum rabbi, who goes onto one of these Cunard liners, and he meets the shomer, and he says to the shomer, "Can one eat here?" So this is after the war, not before. So, "Can one eat here?" So the shomer says, "No." So the rabbi says, "So what are you doing here? You're the showman, that you can't eat here." He says, "I'm here to tell people like you not to eat here." So that's how it was after the war. So that was a bit about Hertz in the war.
Just en passant, David.
Yes.
In 1936, as you may have picked up, I'm an aficionado of JFS history. In 1936, JFS made a Chanukiah for the Queen Mary, which was presented, and eventually I got it back from Long Beach, and it actually now sits in Kenton.
How wonderful! Because I met a man in a dealer in California who told me that he had owned the Oren Kodesh and the Bimmer from the Queen Mary, and then he'd given it to somebody and whatever. So I said, "You should have sold it to me." Although what my wife would think about me having the Bimmer of the Queen Mary, it is interesting, and I'd like to go one day to Long Beach and see what is actually left, if there is any Judaica left from there. But there were, if you look, David, in the Jewish Chronicle at the time of the launching of the Queen Mary, there was a special supplement which features all the appurtenances. So it may even feature the menorah in there. So that was the interwar years, and I'm sorry if this is too much of a whistle-stop tour, but I'm trying to get as much in as possible. And then we get to the Second World War, and here is the most tragic thing that I'm going to show you. So here is the picture of Chief Rabbi Hertz at the front preaching in the ruins of the Great Synagogue. So we saw the beautiful picture of the Great Synagogue as it was in the 1800s. Here it is in 1941, destroyed by German bombing. And he finishes his speech. Hertz was nothing, of course, if not dramatic. "Unshakable, therefore, is our confidence that a new day of freedom will dawn for all men. God will comfort Zion and rebuild her waste places. Victory will crown the righteous cause of Britain, and the Great Synagogue will rise again." Well, of course, thank God victory did crown the cause of Britain, but the Great Synagogue did not rise again because it was in the wrong place. The United Synagogue took the insurance money and used it to build Marble Arch. So a tragedy, but one that did result in a nice new shul in perhaps a more area. Now, we've seen medals from the First World War. I want to show you some medals from the Second World War. And here they are. These are the medals of somebody who some of you may remember, perhaps even Rabbi Louis Rabinowitz, who was the rabbi of Cricklewood Shul, and then went to South Africa. And these are his medals when he was a chaplain in the Second World War. And on the other side, you may be able to see George V. That's his commission to be a chaplain from the king. Why am I showing you this? Because these medals lost him the chief rabbinate, in my view. So when Louis Rabinowitz left Cricklewood in the 1930s, there was a reception, and Chief Rabbi Hertz spoke, and he said, "We have no doubt you will return to great things." So Hertz saw him as his successor, and he didn't succeed him, both at the time Hertz died, or indeed again when Jacobowitz came in after Brodie retired, when he could have done so equally well. Why? Because in 1947, there was a protest meeting in South Africa against the British actions in Palestine. And Rabinowitz addressed this meeting wearing his medals. And he said, "We who fought for Britain are ashamed of Britain, and I will never wear these medals again." And he took them, tore them off his chest and threw them on the floor, which is throwing the king's head on the floor, of course. So, because the king's head is on the medals. So he never became chief rabbi because of that, in my view. But there's a very interesting story, which I was told, some of you may know Professor David Newman, who's a professor in, I think, Ben Gurion in the Negev. And he is a nephew of Rabinowitz. And I told him this story. And I said to him, you know, I bought these medals in a sale of things sold by the family in an auction. So he must have got them back. He says, I'll tell you exactly how he got them back. He said, when his children were sitting shiva for Rabbi Rabinowitz, a man comes along and he says, I was a Talmud of your father in South Africa. And the night before this meeting, he said to me, tomorrow in this meeting, in a spontaneous gesture, I'm going to tear off my medals and throw them on the floor. You are going to sit in the front row and pick them up and bring them back to me. So that's how he got the medals back. So Rabinowitz didn't get the chief rabbinate. Who did get the chief rabbinate was a splendid man who was, of course, a chaplain in the forces. Here he is. So he's the one just here, Israel Brodie, who was seen as a safe pair of hands, a jolly good English gentleman. And he would be sort of, if you like, do what the grandees told him. I'm not going to talk about the Jacobs affair, but obviously in the Jacobs affair, he didn't actually do what they told him to do. So he was a bit sort of, you know, he did his own thing. People may approve of that or disapprove of that, but they didn't quite get what they bargained for.
Would I be right, David? Can I just check? Right in thinking that Israel Brodie was the first chief rabbi who was actually born in this country. Is that right?
No. So Solomon Herschel, who was before Adler, was born in this country during a very brief period when his father was chief rabbi in the 1760s. So he was British born, but Brodie was the first one who was British born and bred, shall we say, brought up in Britain and so on. And so he was seen very much as a safe pair of hands compared to others who might be more difficult. And Jacobowitz, also at the same time he was elected, Rabinowitz was again a candidate, but he didn't get there because of the arguments, whatever. Now, I just want to come, and I'm conscious of time in case people want to ask questions. I want to get to the sort of end point, which is really about Zionism and the state of Israel. And so in Brodie's time, just after he was made chief rabbi, the great event occurred, the state of Israel was declared. And the United Synagogue, interestingly, completely ignored it. No service was held. My book has lots and lots of services, orders of service. It has no service of the United Synagogue celebrating the foundation of the state. There was one in Hendon Shul. Here it is. This is the day, Zeh Hayom. But this is a service held by the Mizrahi in the Hendon Synagogue. It's not a United Synagogue service. And indeed, it took till 1955 for Rabbi Brodie to issue this edict saying representations have been made to me from many quarters in recent years that it would be appropriate for us to be associated with the religious celebration of Yom HaAtzmaut in Israel. I'm satisfied that this is the general view of Anglo Jewry, and I've accordingly decided that it should be the occasion of rejoicing and thanksgiving to the Almighty. 1955, so 7 years before the United Synagogue and the office of the chief rabbi actually celebrated the state of Israel. Why was that? That was because, of course, not all chief rabbis were pro-Zionist. Here he is again, Herman Adler, who was certainly not a Zionist, who was in favor of people being helped in Palestine, but not in Zion. And the reason I'm showing you this bit now, here he is, he looks a bit like his Vanity Fair caricature. This is actually done by the Betzalel Art School. It's a Betzalel piece, unrecorded by Betzalel, And the only explanation I've got is that they must have had somebody from England who was told to do a practice piece, and he thought, I'll have a go at the chief rabbi. Hermann Adler was not Zionist. Hertz was, of course, extraordinarily Zionist, wrote to the Times before the Balfour Declaration, attacking the grandees of Anglo Jewry who didn't want the Balfour Declaration. And we could perhaps reflect that if Hermann Adler had lived another 7 or 8 years, there probably would not have been a Balfour Declaration, because the British government sounded out Anglo-Jewish opinion before it issued the Balfour Declaration. And it was quite finely balanced between those who were in favor and those who were against. If the chief rabbi had been against rather than in favor, it was likely that it would never happen. So ironic, of course, because, and I'm going to finish with this, the greatest English Jew of the 19th century, Sir Moses Montefiore, devoted his whole life to helping people in the Holy Land and also around the world. So here he is, actually in a montage that I made. He's at the bottom here, or the bottom down here. Up here is Nathan Adler, and the rest of the items here, we've got an invitation, Montefiore's invitation to Nathan Marcus Adler's induction. Hopefully Montefiore spoke German, so that he could understand what was going on. And a letter from Montefiore to Adler thanking him for a donation to Palestine. So Montefiore was a great Zionist, if you like, or certainly supporter of Jews in the Holy Land and Jews around the world. Now, I'm going to show you now the biggest thing that I'm going to show you. I don't know whether you're going to be able to see it, but here it is. It's even bigger than me. And what this is about the Damascus affair. So the Damascus affair, when Jews were arrested in Damascus, tortured, thrown into prison on a blood libel for using the blood of Christian children for Pesach. And what we have here, the main item, is an edition of the Times from 1842, which reprints the entire Haggadah in English to show non-Jews that we are not the sort of people who are using blood for Pesach. And so this was reprinted as a whole page of the Times. So you've got it there, and that's of great interest, of course. Here's Montefiore up here, but I want to tell you the story of this little item here, this little letter. Let me put this down. So I was in New York, and I went into a book dealer in New York, a letter dealer, very upmarket in Manhattan, and any Judaica, English Judaica, known, and we have a whole discussion, a very nice schmooze. And after about an hour, he says to me, so if you're from, I was just going, you're from England? I said, yes. He said, so I collect, he says, Robert Frost, the poet. And he spent some time in Berkhamsted in England. If you're ever there, you know, sometimes some Frost thing might turn up there. Buy it for me and I'll whatever. So I said, you know, that's like Sir Moses Montefiore and Ramsgate. Sometimes you find things in Kent that link to Montefiore. Ah, he says, I have something of Montefiore. So he brings out this little scrap of paper here. Now, this is a letter from Sir Moses. And normally letters from Sir Moses are basically written by a secretary and signed by him, especially when he was very old. And they're mostly about, you know, actually you saw one to Adler, I acknowledge 3 guineas for the Holy Land. And those letters still sell for good money today. This is not that. This is a letter written in his own handwriting, and it's written to one of his associates, Dr. Louis Lowy, and it says that please come to me tomorrow night in Park Lane. We must discuss Mehmet Ali and the captives. So this is about the Damascus affair. Mehmet Ali was the ruler of that area, and so it's a direct reference to the Damascus affair. Now, of course, my hands as a collector were shaking at this moment as how was I going to acquire this for a reasonable amount of money? And so the dealer, who was very expensive upmarket dealer, said, well, I haven't really had a chance to look at it. I haven't had a chance to research it. You go back to England and we'll send emails and we'll sort it out. So I thought to myself, the one lesson on these occasions is never press, because if you press, it shows how interested you are. If you say, could you give me a price now, I must have a price now, the price will go up. So I went off and I went into cab and I was going somewhere uptown in the cab. When I look at what in those days, my BlackBerry, and it says from this dealer, I've decided on the price and it's X. And the price was a price that you could pay easily for a letter written by a secretary, which says, thank you for your 2 guineas for the Holy Land. So I said to the cab driver, turn the cab round and go back. And I went straight back and gave him the money and bought this thing, which I think is one of the nicest things. Goes very well with the times, whatever. And of course, goes very well with something that David will know very, very well. And some of you may have seen in your shul, which is the Torah shield that contains on the top of it a series of biblical verses praising Sir Moses, and is dated on the day that Sir Moses came back from the Damascus affair. I hesitate to say much more about it because David could give you a whole lecture about it, but suffice it to say that I know this was used in your shul, owned by the United Synagogue. I don't know what the nature of the deal between you and the United Synagogue was in terms of the sale. I don't really want to know. But anyway, I bought it in the auction in Sotheby's in New York that took place just before the end of last year. So, and that's now one of the prized pieces of my collection. So hopefully, having listened to me tonight, you are content that this item that was in your shul, all the members of the shul that are here, are content that it's gone to a good home.
Well, it's in safe, David, it's in safe hands. Just for those who are curious about it, Michael Goldstein, when it came to our shul once and asked how we got it, and I explained that Sir Moses was the founder member of Belmont, which I don't think he believed. But there, as you know, because we've talked about it quite a lot, there is no evidence that Sir Moses actually got it, because so many things were produced at that time in honor of this remarkable achievement of his, really internationalizing the Jewish people. And we'll be hearing more about that next week from Professor Abigail Green, who is a Sebag Montefiore and wrote a fantastic biography of Sir Moses and Lady Judith. And she'll be talking about his life, but also the internationalization of him. Yes. David, this has been
just before you finish, David, I want to show one more thing on Sir Moses.
Sorry, yes.
Illustrates better than anything the great regard that he was held in. And I think it's on the poster. But let me put this here. This is a little advert showing Sir Moses sitting in his chair at a grand old age. It comes from a non-Jewish magazine, the Illustrated London News. And I want to finish by just reading the caption. All may not reach Sir Moses' great age, he was 100 at the time, but all may prolong their lives and add to their enjoyment by smoking Allen and Gunter's absolutely pure cigarettes. So I don't think you can get Allen and Gunter's absolutely pure cigarettes anymore, and I do advise you not to smoke them, but it does show the regard he was held in, that they thought that people would buy cigarettes, which at the time, of course, were seen as stress relaxants and so on. Then he was used as that sort of advertising machinery. So I'll stop there. Thank you all very much and for your attention. Thank you those who are making positive comments on the sidebar. And I do apologize about the format, and I'm delighted to come to your shul with some of these things and show you them in person, because obviously it works much better.
Well, Lashana Habar, as they say at this time of the year. I don't know if anybody's got any. I mean, lots of people getting in really great, how fabulous it was, and fascinating to hear in this amazing overview of modern Anglo-Jewish history. I think everybody's too stunned to actually ask specific questions. David, thank you very much indeed, giving your time. It has been a fascinating insight into modern Jewish history and some of the conflicts, no doubt, that still go on and tensions that still exist. I'm going to take this opportunity then of thanking you, wishing you a good evening, and we look forward to welcoming you to Belmont, which, and as I explained to Michael Goldstein, it has the Montes at the end is for Montefiore.
And I promise not to remove any of your synagogue appurtenances without your permission. So.
That's a decent price, David.
That's a decent price, of course, absolutely.
Thanks a lot, David. Good night to you.
And thank you all for listening in. Thank you.
Stay well. Cheers. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Rounds of applause there, David.
Yeah, I can see. Thank you so much. Pleasure.
Bye.